So we're going to be talking about BIOS and how to improve your PC performance through just two settings. Now to get into your BIOS menu, it's going to be when your computer is first booting up. Before Windows posts, depending on the software you're running, it's going to usually be one of your F keys. So for mine, for example, it's going to be F11, and prior to Windows posting, I'm going to see a prompt on the bottom right below the logo to say press F11 to get into BIOS. I'm going to press it at that time, and that'll log us into our BIOS menu. Now when it comes to BIOS, you should definitely know what you're doing before you change anything within there. And if you accidentally ever get into your BIOS, you can always press the escape key and you'll get a prompt to quit without saving settings. Now besides that, these are two settings that most anybody can change on their computer, and you don't have to have too big of a base of knowledge to know how to do so. So with that said, let's move ahead. So when you first open up BIOS, you're going to be greeted with a screen that might look pretty similar to this, depending on which brand that you're running. So for me, I have MSI, so this is how my BIOS is going to look once I get in there. Now, this is what's going to be called the advanced screen. What you'll initially see is going to be something that's the easy mode. This is going to show you things like CPU, memory speed, fan curves, and help prompts if you need it at the bottom. But for the sake of the video, we're going to focus a little bit more on the advanced mode for now. On the top right, you're going to see your motherboard, CPU, the amount of memory that you have, core voltage, RAM voltage, the BIOS version you're currently using, and when that BIOS was actually built. Now on the left-hand side, we're going to see our CPU speed and our DDR speed. DDR speed is going to reference our RAM speed and the amount of voltage that's currently going into it. So mine's currently running 3600 megahertz, but when it's coming out of the box default, it's going to say 2666, and that's just the motherboard putting it at a default mode. Now whether or not it's capable of higher speeds like 3600 or 4000, we have to enable what's called an XMP file to get those speeds, and you also have to verify that your motherboard is capable of those speeds. Now when you want to enable XMP, it's going to initially be off when you first see it. It's going to be the little button on the left and it'll be grayed out. But to turn it on, all you have to simply do is just hit the on button to get the advertised speed of what your RAM should be having. So mine, for example, again was at 3600. I'm going to hit that on button. Now it'll still say 2666 initially, but once I restart my computer and go back into BIOS to verify, I should see that advertised speed of 3600. Now next we're going to work with our fan speeds. So we're going to see our motherboard and CPU temperatures up here, and temperatures are very important because if we get too hot, we're going to get what's called thermal throttled and slow down performance. So in our hardware monitor, we're going to see that I have CPU 1 and pump 1 set up. CPU 1 is because all of my fans are hooked up to my CPU header, and that's because I'm running what's called an AIO, and my only other thing is going to be a pump header where my cooling system is set up. So all of my fans are going to be hooked up to a single point, and they're all going to be controlled by a PWM module. Now the difference between PWM and DC is going to be direct current and pulse width modulation. DC is only going to change when voltages change, and PWM is going to change based on the temperatures of the CPU getting hotter and or cooler, with the fan speeds going either higher or lower. And smart fan mode also enables us to have this curvature up here where we can set up to where the fans are not always ramped up at 100%, but more so based on a scaling of temperature to where the percentage and the load is going to increase and how hard the fans are working. So the pump is going to show an RPM, whereas the fan speed is going to show a RPM of fans. The pump is going to be slightly different because it is pumping water, whereas the fans are just turning in air. So we see down here that the lowest temp is going to always be at a 20% load. So whether it's from 0 to 20 degrees Celsius, I am going to be keeping the fans at a minimum of a fifth of their power. Smart fan mode up there again is going to enable us to have this graph up here, and PWM again is going to be based on whether or not you have a 4-pin or 3-pin fan setup. So if you have 4-pin, you're always going to want to have PWM enabled. If you have a 3-pin and the motherboard is still 3-pin, it's not going to matter if you have a 4-pin fan because DC is all that's going to work. But for our motherboard, We have a 4-pin header as well as 4-pin fans that are going to enable us to have this graph that is going to move up and down based off of our temperatures. Now on the bottom we're going to see the temps of everything we're working with, whether it's our CPU, temp, our motherboard, chipset, PCIe lanes, and or our M2 drives. Now these are important because these are going to be a pretty good indicator of what our idle speeds are looking like. And you want to look at your hardware because every hardware is going to be different at the temperature that it's going to be idling at. For me, I'm running a Ryzen CPU and they tend to run a little bit hotter, so seeing that idle speed of around 34 degrees Celsius like I have right now is pretty average and where I'd like to be. Now if I make a change I don't like, I have the settings on the right hand side to cancel everything and try again if I'm running too high or too low. On the top left, we'll see that I'm currently working with the CPU temperatures only, and that's going to be important because you can base your temps off other areas if you'd like. When I'm all done, all I'm going to do is hit that X in the top right, and then hit the X in the top right of this BIOS again. It's going to show the settings I've changed, save them, and I'm all done.